Hello everyone, welcome to our Egyptian online seminar group. First, keep your microphones and the camera off. Then, if you have any questions, you can ask our speakers during her presentation. I have great pleasure of welcoming Professor Peter Easton. Professor Peter Easton is a professor of accounting and academic director of Center for Accounting Research and Education at the University of Notre Dame. Professor Easton's research interest mainly leans in corporate valuations and financial statement analysis, cost analysis, and earnings forecasting, enterprise operations strategy from accounting and financial perspective. His research papers have been published in top-ranking journals such as the Journal of Applied Corporate Finance, Journal of Financial Reporting, Journal of Accounting Research. He is now serving as editor-in-chief for Review of Accounting Studies, associate editor for another five leading journals, including Journal of Accounting Research, Accounting and Business Research, Accounting and Finance, Journal of Business Finance and Accounting, Journal of Accounting, Auditing and Finance. Now we will start our seminar with Professor Peter Easton.
So first of all, can everyone hear? Can you hear me, Mohammed?
Yes, of course.
Okay, great. So first of all, thank you everyone for coming, and particularly thanks to Mohammed for setting this up. It's an incredible opportunity to be able to sit in my study in Chicago and talk to a lot of people in Cairo and perhaps from other parts of the world. It really is fabulous. And I look forward to any comments that you might have on this paper. The paper is quite new. I have never presented this paper before, and so I will get a lot out of the presentation, I'm sure. The paper, as the title says, is forecasting earnings. Of course, earnings is the key variable in our business, using a machine learning technique, nearest neighbor matching, which of course I'll describe in detail. The paper is joint with four other co-authors. The first one, Martin Capons, is a PhD student at Tilburg, an awesome young man who surely will have a great career. He will be on the market next year. Steve Monahan from the University of Utah, who's been a long-time co-author and friend. And of course, we continue to enjoy working together. Harm Schut and Eric Wiesbrod, younger faculty. I've started working with them both recently, and it's a great joy. So this is a joint paper. The contribution comes from all five of us in equal amounts, and we all look forward to your feedback. Let me talk briefly about the paper, and then I'll open it up for questions. Although for some questions I might say, look, let's wait, and we'll talk about it when we get to the particular part of the presentation. So here's what we do. We've created what could be called a highly sophisticated forecasting model using several factors, and it's wrong. Now, I hope that you'll agree that despite this, our paper actually does make a contribution, and I'll try to convince you that that's the case. So what do we do? What we aim to do, and I hope we achieve this, is to develop a new, I don't think anything's been done like this before, simple earnings forecasting method. Now, why do we want to do this? Well, there's two issues. First of all, the practical question of earnings forecasts are central to valuation. They're central to a lot of our research in accounting and finance. And therefore, from a practical point of view, both practitioners and academics can benefit from a more accurate forecast of earnings. And to date, our forecasts have a great deal of error. We'll reduce that error somewhat, although the error still remains. Theoretically, our contribution is to learn more about the link between the past earnings sequence and future expected earnings. Now, in a nutshell, how do we do this? Our idea is to mirror, emulate, if you like, the practice of drawing inferences from comparable firms, which we all tend to teach in our financial statement analysis and valuation classes. The focus is on forecasting earnings, out of which we might back cash flows in order to get a value, or we might use those earnings directly. What do we do when we're forecasting those earnings? Generally, we encourage our students, and therefore hopefully practitioners in the long run, to look at comparable firms. And simply put, if we're valuing Pepsi, we would certainly look at Coke as an example. So the main points from the paper are, we can compare the subject firm, and I'll give you an example in a minute of IBM, examples in the paper. The subject firm, IBM's recent trend in its annual earnings, and we compare it to similar past earning sequences of other firms. So we find firms whose earnings sequence most closely matches the sequence of the subject firm, in this case IBM. And this is referred to as nearest neighbour matching. Again, I'll describe this in some detail. Now, once we've established our nearest neighbours, however many that is, and you'll see later in the paper that we settle on 80 nearest neighbours, then the subject firm's future earnings is forecasted by taking the median realised earnings of the nearest neighbour matches in the subsequent year. Again, the example of IBM will probably be helpful in a second. And the whole motivation for this paper, way back when we started to think about it, was the idea is to mimic the common valuation practice of comparing firms' past trend in whatever fundamentals with a set of other firms, and use that to forecast. So here's the example that hopefully will capture the main point. In this chart, the black line represents IBM's earnings over the period from, this is going to be 2007 through, 2006 through 2010. We find that in this case, the 10 firms, which we've all labelled here, that most closely mirror IBM's earnings over this, over this 5-year period. Now, IBM, of course, doesn't exist in the next year. We're trying to forecast for the next year. In other words, we're pretending that we're at the end of 2011, trying to forecast IBM's earnings for 2012. So what we do is we take the median of, my mouse is playing up, the median of the 10 matched firms' earnings in the next year when they do indeed exist. And that median then is taken as our forecast for IBM. Now, you will see in the second part of this slide, this is a figure in the paper, that we're comparing, for example, is IBM, this is a subject firm, we're forecasting this year. One of the comparable firms is Envision Healthcare. We take its earnings from, what is this going to be, 2006 to 2010, and we use its 2011 earnings as a basis for forming our forecast. We take the median of the 2011 earnings for Envision, the 2011 earnings for Camden, etc., and that median is the forecast for IBM for 2012. Similarly, we could forecast using the trend in the earnings for these firms for the next year and for the next year to forecast IBM's earnings for 2013 and 2014. The bottom line of the paper is that these nearest neighbour matched forecasts are considerably more accurate, and hopefully our analyses, which I'll present shortly, will convince you that that's the case. They're more accurate than regression-based forecasts, which are common in the literature. I'll talk about them some in a second. And random walk forecast, which is the benchmark that we've had trouble beating. This is especially the case for firm years where we don't have analyst coverage, and that, of course, is a good thing because we want to fill in the gaps. We want to have forecasts when we don't have analysts. And then, of course, that forecast might be useful in both research and practice. Excuse me. When in fact analyst forecasts are not available. We also compare the accuracy of nearest neighbour match forecast based on IBIS street earnings. So we replicate the whole procedure using street earnings as opposed to bottom line earnings or earnings before special items.
Just a quick question here, Professor.
Sure,
it is like more accurate in sense of what? Of like in a prediction error or what?
It's more accurate in the prediction error. So we have 4 measures of accuracy. The one that we focus on is the mean absolute forecast error, which is simply the mean of the absolute difference between the actual observed number and the number that we forecast. We have other measures which I'll talk about in a second, but the mean is the most common used measure. Our results tend to be quite similar across all 3 measures of accuracy. But also an important point is not only are these more accurate, but if we use the nearest neighbour match forecast instead of, for example, regression-based forecast to forecast future returns, the nearest neighbour match model does better. So the proof's in the pudding. We at the end can actually forecast returns better using nearest neighbour match forecast than forecasts based on regression models. Maybe I should stop there to see if there's any sort of general questions before we get into the specifics.
Just another question, Professor. Go ahead. Yeah. Okay. Just like when you compare it with like a regression model, you mean here the parametric regression model, is this right, or you are using like different type of regression, like non-parametric ones?
The regression that we let me just have a slide here which sort of helps in this. So the literature is increasingly using these regression-based models. The premier models are Ho van Dijk and Zhang in JAE and Liam Hammer in Review of Accounting Studies. These models have all been based on, to answer your question, these models have all been based on OLS regressions. Now, in our paper, we do not use OLS regressions. We use median regressions. And the reason we use median regressions is the parameter estimates in an OLS regression are seriously affected by outliers, which means then that if you forecast into the next period, you get a lower level of accuracy than you do if you use a median regression in the estimation period. So to answer your question, we are using a regression-based model, which is parametric, and but we estimate it using median regressions to get rid of outliers. Does that answer the question?
Yes, but you didn't use kernel based regression, like you didn't use non-parametric ones, because as you know, non-parametric regression is based on local points, which it's like not highly sensitive to the outlier also. But you answered the question.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. And we'll possibly come back to that. I mean, feel free to come back to it later if you like. But I guess to sort of continue in this prior literature.
Sorry, but can I have a very quick question?
Sure.
Yeah, it may be a naive question, but I'm asking about what is, in this context, or generally, what is the difference between NNM and BSM, probabilistic score matching? So is NNM here is one of types of BSM in which you just define the caliber and request for repetition or non-repetition, or it is quite different from the well-known PSM technique in doing matching? Thank you.
I think, let me think about that. My first reaction is that they're quite different, but I'm not sure about that. The propensity score matching uses, like nearest neighbor matching,
Yes, because for my understanding, sorry, if we apply NNM or BSM using this data, the output is quite similar, but the technique to apply each of these methods are different in terms of using this data. I'm not quite sure about the econometrics behind each technique, but the method or the way to apply this, for example, using this data is different. This is why I'm just wondering if the NNM used here is just one type of the BSM, and also in literature, for my understanding, if I'm true, they regard BSM as the most accurate way to apply matching. This is in literature. I'm not saying this is true or false.
I think the way I understand it, although I'm stepping into an area I'm not familiar with, my understanding is that propensity score matching is to use a parametric technique to combine a number of variables that will best match firms for whatever reason. Not necessarily forecasting, possibly for your comparison of a particular attribute, such as cost of capital, for example. Here, we've got a much more straightforward method that simply says, I'm going to look at a massive amount of data, and I'm going to find a firm that is similar on 1, 2, possibly 3 dimensions, and it's been similar over 1, 2, 3 time periods. And the method is going to tell me how many matches I should make. Turns out to be 80. With propensity score matching, we would just use the entire data set to determine the propensity score. So I hope that helps. I think as I progress through the paper, you'll see that what we do is in fact really quite simple, as you can see by the IBM example. And I think the bottom line answer to your question is it's quite different to propensity score matching. But let me go on, and if you want to come back to it, feel free to do that.
Peter? Yeah, sure, thanks.
Okay. Yes, please.
This is Samir.
Yes,
Nice
Samir.
paper. What's the assumption is made in this paper with regard to earnings quality? You know, because we are looking for the nearest neighbor. Are we like looking for the nearest? For example, if one company, the nearest neighbor is managing earnings, you know, the earnings is noisy. So we're gonna get the nearest neighbor as another company who's cooking the books, like, you know. That's my first question. My second question is there is a paper that look at the informativeness of accrual and cash flow according to the business cycle, you know. This is the show paper, you know. Did you, I mean, you know, did you look at like the component of the earnings in terms of nearest neighbor? You know, because I read the paper, I didn't see that, you know.
Okay. Okay, the two questions. First of all, what about earnings management? It is absolutely the case that we might be matching a firm which possibly is not managing its earnings to a firm that is managing its earnings.
Yeah.
However, that's a fundamental problem that exists in whatever method we've got, right? You know, if we use regression, we've got the same problem. And for that matter, how would we know whether our subject firm is matching or not? And it's also not obvious that it will matter if the comparable firms are managing earnings while the subject firm is not managing earnings. What matters, we'll see, is that the trends are the same. And who knows, the reason for the management could be to create a particular trend. You know, as smoothing, for example, so that the earning sequence conveys a trend in long-run future earnings that wouldn't be conveyed with smooth earnings, non-smooth earnings. With respect to the components question, we may have at one point in time looked at components, your accruals versus free cash flow, for example. We've looked at many components. But the bottom line is that you can't beat just earnings. And as a matter of fact, even in the regression-based literature, trying to forecast earnings based on components of earnings doesn't work. In other words, earnings alone works better than two components of earnings in out-of-sample forecasting. So the answer to your question is we probably have tried it, Samir, but at the end, one factor, just earnings itself, is all we need. And another variable tends to create a problem. And basically the idea is that if you're trying to match on just one variable, you'll get a better match on that variable than if you had two.
Yeah.
And so this is sort of common, what's referred to, as you know, as the curse of dimensionality. Once you go beyond 1 to 2, you'll get a match on two variables, but the match on either one of those variables won't be as good as if you just matched on one of the variables.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. So is there another question? Okay. So unfortunately, this literature is at a state where, though people are using the forecast from cross-sectional regressions, there's a fair amount of evidence that they may, in some circumstances, slightly beat a random walk, but that's not at all obvious. So we end up with a situation where the regression-based models, though used a lot, are actually no better than saying earnings next period is the same as earnings this period. So what do? We first of all determine what is the optimal nearest neighbour forecast, and this gets back to Samir's second question. The best method is a match just on earnings itself. It's based on just 2 years of history. In other words, if we're forecasting IBM for 2012, we look at the 10 past years for peers, or whatever we want to call these neighbours, and all that we need is 2 years out of that 10. Adding the third year doesn't help. In fact, it hinders, makes things worse. And many peers. I'll talk about that in a little bit. We were at first surprised that we needed many peers, that is 80. This surprise came from all of us teach financial statement analysis and valuation, and we're used to having a handful of peers at best. If we get on Yahoo, for example, we see a handful of peers. And so we were a bit surprised at this number. But I'll talk in a little bit about, after thinking about it a little while, this is what we should expect. Another takeaway, the nearest neighbour match is more accurate than a random walk or regression-based forecast over both short and long forecast horizons. We forecast out for 3 years. Nearest neighbour match is not statistically worse than analyst forecasts. It performs well in cases with no analyst forecast available. And this last point is important in as much as that's when we need a mechanical model, so to speak. So the rest of the presentation focuses on these 3 specific research questions. First of all, how and why, of course, can nearest neighbour matching prediction models best be used to forecast earnings? Clearly, there's a lot of options in setting up a nearest neighbour match prediction model, and we're trying to get a sense of what are the better prediction methods, parameters of these NMMs that we should use. And I say we can never nail this down specifically because it would depend on circumstance, but you'll see how we do it in a second. The second question is, how accurate are these forecasts compared with competing approaches? And then finally, in what circumstances are we better off using, or very well off, by using NMM, nearest neighbour match forecasts? Okay, so I can go through the math here, but I don't think I will. We describe the math of the nearest neighbour matching in the paper in a lot of detail. But for now, what's important, the key is the difference between the particular matched element, feature, FEAT feature, which will call for start earnings. What's the difference between that and the same feature for matched samples from all of the population of available matches? We can do that for several features, so we sum across several features and some across years. So M references years, F references features, and we can sum this across as many matches as we can. So this is the Euclidean distance between each element of the vector of the feature, which in this case is earnings, and the same feature for the entire population of available data. And we take, in our case, we end up with the K of these distances that are smallest. That's our nearest neighbours match, 80 nearest neighbours. Any questions about that?
So, Peter, the accuracy,
Sure.
So the accuracy of any forecast will depend on the length of the sequence and the number of neighbor,
That's right.
It's like the blue for OLS, right? The more observation we have, But is there an optimal number? Like, did you kind of say, okay, here is optimality, above that, we're just wasting.
Yes, there is. Yeah, there is. And I'll spell that out in a second. And we find that the optimal K is 80. But I'll show you how we come to that conclusion in a second. Okay, and of course, once we identify the nearest neighbours, the 80 nearest neighbours, then we simply get a forecast of earnings for our subject firm using the median earnings in the next period for the firms that have been found to be nearest neighbours. Okay, so our sample, normally I wouldn't spend any time on this slide, construction of the sample, but I think it's important in this paper. We start with the CompStat population. We lose a lot of observations because we've got missing earnings before special items. This is primarily in the forecast year. Remember that we're setting up data to T and we're forecasting T plus 1. And of course, T plus 1 may not exist for a lot of firms. That's primarily why we lose these observations. All of our analyses are based on 4 different deflators to determine the importance of deflating the earnings number in the matching procedure. And so we decide to use the same sample across all deflators in the comparison. That brings us down to 213,000 observations, for which, of course, we can get a random walk forecast. In order to get our nearest neighbour match, we need two last periods of earnings, and so we lose another 5,000 observations. So we can do nearest neighbour matches on 207,000 observations. Importantly here, we can get a nearest neighbour match for almost all of the firms for which we can get a random walk forecast. We don't lose much in doing a nearest neighbour match. And then if we then take out the variables required, if we then take out the key variable required in the regression-based model, Ho Van Dijk and Zhang, we lose another 40,000 observations, and we eliminate the very small firms, another 24,000, leaves us with 132,000 in our main comparisons. We do, in some parts of the paper, and I'll point out where, use more of these observations. This makes the same point. The square box is 100% of the observations for which we get random walk forecast. We can make nearest neighbour matches for most of them, 97.5%. If we want a regression-based model, we're down to 78.9. Analysts cover 53.8. In other words, we get an additional 44% of observations for which we can get forecasts using nearest neighbour matches. Now there's a question very early from Mohammed, I think. I'm sorry if I got the person wrong. How do we measure accuracy? Most of our emphasis is on the median absolute forecast error, which is just the actual minus the forecast. We deflate by various deflators. The main results are based on deflating by market value of equity. We've got the median of the same thing. We've got the squared error. Why do we use the squared error? First of all, it's used frequently. But second, it tends to emphasize outliers. And this may be important. And if you're putting your money where your mouth is with respect to these forecasts, you might be worried about the outliers. But this measure is very much driven by outliers, and therefore we trim it. So we do the same thing, squared forecast error, but we eliminate the top. Quite few, not very many, 0.1% of forecast errors. And you'll see that makes a tremendous difference. Okay, so Samir, this starts to get to your, what's the optimal number? In this figure, we attempt to demonstrate why matching might work. Now, if you look at this green line, the green line that says, sorry, is there a question? Okay, so what the green line shows is the forecast error if we assume a random walk. So if we assume a random walk, of course, having more matches is not going to make any difference. And so the average error is whatever this is, about 7.8%. Okay. Now, if we randomly choose 10 observations, just randomly choose 10 from the entire population, our error is about 10.3%. If we now randomly choose 20 observations, our error goes down. Excuse me, I really am having trouble with this mouse. Okay. And again, if we now randomly choose 30 and take the mean, where error goes down, it goes down and down and down, and then it flattens out. Okay. But this is not randomly matching. It's just saying, let's choose 10, take the mean. Let's choose 20, take the mean. Let's choose 30, take the mean. Let's choose 40, take the mean. But now let's introduce matching. So now we have our nearest neighbour match. If we match on just 10, we're a little better off than a random walk. Match on 20, we're more better off. More better off with 30, and so on, and so on, and so on. And this keeps getting us better off. So what we do here in this blue line with triangles, what we do is we say we're going to match 10 nearest neighbours, 20 nearest neighbours, 30 nearest neighbours, 40 nearest neighbours, and take the median of the earnings in the year of the match as our forecast. In other words, we forecast a random walk from the match. Okay. But then in the next graph here, what we do is we don't just match. We don't just match. But what we do is we say, okay, we've matched now, and we're going to use the observed earnings in T+1 for the 10 matched firms as the forecast for the next year. And then the median for the next year as the forecast, etc., etc., etc. And you'll see, Samir, this really does answer your question, that this flattens out at about 80. That's how we determine the optimal. And as a matter of fact, I'm going to come back and make the comment that you made about 30 for a best linear unbiased estimate. Because the comparison is very, very much the same. Clearly a regression with a handful of observations is not very useful. And there comes the point where there's an optimal number of observations in the regression. That's exactly what we're showing here. And just to underscore, what's the difference between the blue line and the purple line, which we actually use? If we go back to the IBM example, the forecast, I'm sorry about this mouse. So the forecast that we would have used would be the median at this point in time. That gives us the line that's higher. That gives us this line. But if we look at the growth, the trend, in other words, that we pick up from the matched firms, then you'll see, as in this example, the red line slopes up. In other words, that growth, if you like, the trend, which could also be a decline, the trend is useful. It decreases error substantially from the blue line to the purple line. Or is that black? I can't see, but you can see what I'm referring to. Okay, so the black line is now this line, this one. It's the same line. But now what we do is we look at, well, let us suppose that instead of matching, this line is the 2-year line. This is the one that was in the previous graph. But now we look at, suppose we just had 1 year to match, that would be this line. If we match for 3 years going back, that is this line. If we match for 4 years going back, that's this line, and 5 years going back, that's this line. In other words, it's very clear, I hope, from this graph that we're better off using 2 years where the error is always less than using 3 years. I really apologize for this mouse. 3 years, 1 year, 4 years, or 5 years. What is also evident from this graph is that adding more years can be a problem. So if, for example, we're, adding more matches could be a problem. So if, for example, we look at going back 5 years, after we've got 20 matches, we start getting worse off. In other words, this downward trend, which we do see for m equals 2, may not always be seen. And in fact, this line might even kick up later. We haven't looked.
Peter?
Yes.
This is Sammy. I do really like your paper, so.
Well, thank you.
Is this due to the time series property of earnings, like within firm, or it is due to the correlation between earnings between firm, right? So it could be like, the series of earnings for one particular firm has nothing to do with that other. That's why if you go back, it doesn't matter, right? Or it could be the case that the correlation between the firm that you're trying to match to, is weak. What's the explanation? If you go back,
I see the question. I don't think we can do a lot to answer that, other than I think this diagram's helpful, in as much as this is the correlation. This is the correlation in the earnings numbers. If we just look at matching similar earnings numbers, this is what we've got. But if we look at the trend or growth or decline or whatever you want to call this thing, in other words, the change from T to T plus 1, we get more traction. I think the other sort of answer to your implicit question is, why is 2 optimal? Well, if we start with 1, we don't get any trend.
Yeah.
We go to 2, we get a trend. If we go to 3, we're back to the cursive dimensionality problem again. If you match on just 2 years, very well. You're better off than matching on 3 years, not so well. I think that's the answer to your question. But in a sense, it sort of proves in the data, right? And I don't want to say it is what it is, but it sort of is the situation. It can only be put down, I think, and we'll see more of this cursive dimensionality as we go on. Matching on too many variables, in fact, more than one variable over 2 years, actually makes you worse off. And, as an aside, in the background, we're comparing with regression analyses.
Yeah.
Using, adding accruals in the Ho Van Dijk and Zhang regression doesn't add to the forecast accuracy. In other words, even in a regression framework, using just earnings, possibly as with Liam Hamron, with the loss dummy, is as good as you can get. In this sort of method of looking for patterns across similar firms, or in the case of regression, all firms. Okay, so I think I might have answered some of these questions, but so there's a couple of questions that I think people are surely asking. So the first one is, why does using just earnings provide the most accurate forecast, and why just M equals 2? In other words, 2 years. Well, I think the earnings and earnings growth is clearly the message that we get out of most of the literature today, both empirical and theory literature, and the use by analysts. So your bottom line of Olson's paper with Yutman and Rowe is, if you've got earnings and earnings growth, you've got pretty much what you need for valuation. You're going to be struggling to get much beyond that. Because these two variables, what is earnings now and how is earnings going to grow, are such important fundamental indicators of value. And of course, Jim's work is very much behind, or helps us understand why, in practice, we might see analysts very, very focused on two variables, the PE and the PEG, or PE to growth variable. In terms of the why so few, one feature and 2 years, this gets back to the curse of dimensionality that I've mentioned now a couple of times. Matching on too many things gives you a poor match on everything, so to speak. Why K equals 80? This, in the nearest neighbour literature, which we have all delved into as much as we could, but it's a vast literature. One of the terms that is common is this bias variance trade-off. And basically the point here is that if you have a very small K, very small number of neighbours, you'll get a very close match. But the forecast will be noisy, because the forecast will be biased toward what you happen to have matched to in the prior period. As you get more neighbours, the variance will increase. This will get rid of the bias, and you can rely on the median, which is not affected by the variance, to be more accurate. Why 80? This is the proof's in the pudding. It's an empirical observation. But I do like the point that, we sort of have this magic number of, there's not a lot of point in running a regression with less than 30 observations. Where does that come from? It comes from the econometric theory that you need the 30 observations to get a minimum confidence in the estimates that you're making. The confidence may increase over 30 to some point. That's an empirical question. So let's look at some results, or perhaps I should stop for questions before we look at results. Okay, so what we have here, I'm sorry, there was a question.
Peter, just like, I'm just like asking, a question, because I'm working here like in a project in California, and we are using like some similar techniques, just like asking, what is like the general conclusion, like saying, okay, if we have, do you mean like if you have earning like data we should use NLM, or just there is like some minimal assumptions should be available, and based on that we have to use this technique?
I don't think, I think if I understand your question, there's no minimal assumptions that are necessary. All that we're doing is finding, based on whatever variable we're trying to forecast. Now, in this case, we're trying to forecast earnings for good reasons.
I mean, better like minimal assumption on like data structure from, because I see that you are using like random walk, and does this something like that, it requires stationarity, like the data must be stationary, like like sequence. So I mean, like on the structure of the data, just I'm trying to draw a general conclusion from like your analysis.
I think, I'm not sure I'm understanding your question, but I think the answer is, I'm going to say this a few times, the proof's in the pudding. If it works, it works. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. And the same thing with random walk. I mean, the fact of the matter is, to this point, it's been very hard to beat a random walk. Whether a random walk is descriptive of the true underlying earnings is something that's we are not addressing, and it actually is very rarely addressed, right? In other words, the question is really quite simple. It's, can we get a better forecast? And the forecast is, we're comparing three forecasts, one based on a regression model and all of its implicit assumptions, two based on a random walk, and the simplicity of random walk, next period's earnings is best forecast as this period's earnings, and the nearest neighbor match, which may or may not work.
But we cannot like say, it like, I mean, it based on the situation we have, like it based on, like we cannot say that generalize like a result to other like similar like data or something like that, because
Yeah, go on.
okay,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I should say that the determination of optimal number of features, one, optimal number of years, two, and optimal number of matches was determined in a pre-period. So we took out 10 years of data and we did the optimization in that period. And then we apply feature equals 1, years equal 2, number of neighbors equals 80 to the subsequent 40 years of data. In other words, it's sort of out of, I think that partially answers your question. So we don't want to overfit the data, say it works here in this data. It works here in this data if we take a subset of this data and then apply the parameters to the rest of the data. I think that's important. Similarly, I mean, you could use exactly the same method to forecast the weather, forecast bushfires in California, since you say you're in California. And so you do this based on past data, and you see whether it works on current data. In other words, the assumptions are not the key. It's that it works out of sample that's the key. Does that answer the question?
Yes. Yeah. Thank you, Peter. Yeah.
Okay. So in this page, what we do is we compare the forecast accuracy, which is almost 7% error, based on deflated by value of equity. Alternative deflated, deflators which have, so here would be No, it doesn't help. So the short-term earning sequence alone contains a great deal of information. Okay, so the next issue is comparing the nearest neighbour match forecast with the random walk, here's the random walk, and with Ho, Van Dijk and Zhang, who form forecasts based on a regression of earnings at T+1 on total assets, a dividend dummy, the actual dividend payment, earnings of the prior period, the loss dummy, and accruals. So we do a horse race, if you like, between these two models for forecast out for 1 year, 2 years, and 3 years. And pretty much, if we look at any one of the 16 cells in this table, the results are very, very similar. What does the table do? It looks at forecast error 1 year out, 2 years out, 3 years out, and the aggregate forecast error, which is just to sum the three forecasts together and look at the error. For 2 years out, you'll see that the error is almost 9%, but the random walk is 1.2% worse, and the regression is 1.2% worse. In other words, it has a higher median absolute forecast error. And you'll see these stars for, excuse me again with this mouse, the stars for significance are the same. In other words, no matter what the error indicator, the nearest neighbour match does better. The next thing we did was to say, okay, well, let's see how we do with respect to analysts. You know, here we can't use the HVC, the regression model, because the only variables we have here are street earnings. So what we do is we repeat the entire procedure using nearest neighbour matches based on IBIS actual earnings. And nearest neighbour match gives us a forecast error for street earnings of 7.6%. Analysts are better. And analysts are better significantly if we look at the median forecast error as opposed to the mean. Nevertheless, nearest neighbour match is better than a random walk, significantly better when we look at the median absolute forecast error. The same conclusions apply when we go out 2 periods. In other words, when we've got analysts, they do better than us, or nearest neighbour match, I shouldn't say us, but nevertheless we beat a random walk. So the conclusion then from research question is 2 is nearest neighbour match is uniformly better than the other model-based approaches, even over long horizons. And we get similar forecast error from analysts in 3 out of 4 metrics. In short, the proof is in the pudding. I had to say that because my mentor, Jim Olson, uses that term very frequently. Any of you have heard Jim talk would have heard that phrase. In other words, the results show that our model is better. You know, that comes back to the question, I'm sorry I didn't catch your name, sir, but back from the California question. The model works is the basic issue. So,
Peter?
Yes, please.
This is Samir again. You know, one test that you could do is to run. You know, you remember that paper, Easton and Summers, when they look at when we use the analysis forecast, cost of equity is biased.
Yes.
you can run these forecasts using the nearest neighbor match.
Yeah.
And if one can show that that bias in the cost of equity is overestimated, then one can show that because cost of equity is something very important. But if you can show that using this new methodology, the nearest neighbor provide less biased cost of equity capital estimate, it could have a huge impact. I think. I don't know whether you have thought about it.
Yeah, I see your point. Right? We haven't analysed bias. Or that's not true. We have analysed bias, but the paper was just too big. We haven't put it in the paper.
Okay.
But it's absolutely the case that the nearest neighbour match forecasts are less biased than analyst forecasts. That I can say is the case.
Because that's kind of external validity. That's like now we showed that this nearest neighbor provide better forecast, and then the follow-up question is, what is the usefulness of this finding? One of the usefulness could be, we're going to have better estimate of cost of equity capital for those who are doing cost of equity capital work. Now they won't use the analyst forecast because that optimizes all of those problems. They can use this nearest neighbor methodology.
Yeah, I agree with you. There is something of an issue there that, and some of this literature has used estimates of the cost of capital to see whether the forecasts are better.
Yeah.
The problem with that literature, and I say this as someone who's been involved in the cost of capital literature, the cost of capital estimates are not good, they're poor. And what that means is that if you get a slightly more accurate forecast of earnings, the cost of capital estimate has so much error in it that getting a higher correlation with returns would be nothing short of good luck.
Exactly. I agree.
And so for that reason, we didn't go down that path. But at the same time, I think you'll see at the end of the paper, I believe I have about 25 minutes. Is that right, Mohammed? So I think I have about 25 minutes, so I've got to make sure I get to that point. Okay, so we looked at now to see where these nearest neighbour match forecasts do best. We look at analyst coverage, we look at cross-sectional splits versus based on number of splits and industry. Now, first of all, based on analyst coverage, we split the sample into two groups, those that have analysts and those that don't have analysts. The error is clearly greater if we don't have analyst coverage. But what is important is that the error is significantly less than a random walk and massively significantly less than a regression. And by the way, I should have said, in the appendix to the paper, we've got many of these results for the other regressions that are in the literature. And in the paper itself, we just use HPZ, and the results are pretty similar. Now, of course, when we do have analyst coverage, we get a greater error, but we're still significantly better than a random walk and a regression-based model. In other words, for a researcher or someone wanting a forecast where you don't have analyst coverage, you should be using nearest neighbour match rather than random walk or the regression, which most people are using. We do the analysis across decades. I don't want to dwell on this other than if you look at this chart, you can see that the patterns in all of the 16 cells across the 4 different decades are very, very similar. In other words, the result holds across time. We then form deciles based on realized earnings growth, based on EP ratio, based on earnings deflated by total assets as opposed to market value, and size. So the purple line captures the difference in accuracy of nearest neighbor match and the regression. You can see the purple line is always positive, which means that the nearest neighbor match, no matter what the petition, is better than the regression-based model. If we compare with a random walk, you can see that in most cases, in most cases the model does better. There is a case, and this is where there's an earnings decline, where it does slightly worse. When there's a big earnings increase, it does way better, which is not a big surprise because the model will predict a trend. So it is able to predict an upward trend. This is saying it's not able to predict a downward trend so well. Okay? It doesn't matter what size decile, the model beats a random walk and way beats HPC. We then look at all of the 12 pharma French industry groups. The HPC, well, let's look at that first. So the yellow histogram, if you like, these yellow bars, they represent the median absolute forecast error across each of these industries based on nearest neighbor match. The green is based on a random walk, and the black is the regression model. So you can see that for every one of the pharma French industries, nearest neighbor match outperforms regression and outperforms random walk and vastly outperforms regression. So this is consistent across lots of breakdowns of the data. The last thing that we do, and I think this is a very important part, and Samir does not get at cost of capital, but is in the same direction. And I must say that why do we set it up this way? We set it up this way because we're looking for somewhere where if we don't see something, we're in trouble. So we've got a split here that you might compare in some ways to the original Ball and Brown split, where Ball and Brown split on do earnings increase versus earnings decrease, and they look at, without saying so, they look at the difference between the earnings increase split, which is the upward sloping graph in Ball and Brown, and the earnings decrease, which is the downward sloping graph. So what we do here is for each PE decile, earnings to book in the current period, we look at is earnings forecast to increase, we put it in one bucket. Is earnings forecast to decrease, we put it in the other bucket. And we form a hedge portfolio where we go long in the bucket where earnings are expected to increase, short in the bucket where earnings are expected to decrease, and this is the return that we get. This is the monthly average return. So these numbers might seem small, but to get an annual number, you multiply by 12, which makes them quite big. I'm sorry. And you can see that this occurs for all but one EP quintile. We're to do the same thing for size deciles, and you'll see that no matter what the size decile, we get a positive return. If we do the same thing with Van Dijk and Zijk, we don't necessarily get a positive return. In fact, you'll see negative return. In other words, the petition not only doesn't work, but it gives you a negative return to a strategy that's based on these forecasts and is always worse than the nearest neighbour match model. We do the same thing for the Farmer French 12 industries. The black line, again, is the HVZ. The yellow line is nearest neighbour match. Now, what this shows is that in the energy industry, if you were to form this portfolio, a return strategy based on forecasted earnings increase versus forecasted earnings decrease, you go long those with earnings increase, short those with earnings decrease. You can see you're going to be worse off. Notice the scale here, here's 0. So you're going to be negative, you're going to be worse off. For nearest neighbour match, you're going to be worse off, but not by much. For telecommunications, you're going to be better off, a lot worse off if you use HVZ. Similarly, better off in consumer durables if you use nearest neighbour match, worse off if you use HVZ. The only one where, in fact, HVZ is better than nearest neighbour match is the finance industry, where they're both bad. So, as a matter of fact, this is an analysis we did fairly recently, and quite honestly, we were quite excited about this because it really does show that these forecasts really do help to petition onto whether price is going to go up or price is going to go down. In other words, they are forward-looking, useful forecasts. For those of you know this guy, Jim Olson, and he is my mentor and great friend, and he taught me many, many things, including the saying, the proof is in the pudding. And in my humble view, this picture shows exactly that. The proof is in the pudding. So the conclusion, and I'll just state this conclusion, then we'll have a few minutes for questions, I hope. So first of all, the default nearest neighbour match model is a very simple model. It just requires 2 years of data. It requires a lot of matches. It is the case that finding these matches takes up a lot of computer time, but setting up that computer algorithm is not tough. It's more, for every firm, we are matching to every pair of years over the last 10 years. And getting the closest 80 matches. So you can see that is very computer intensive. We do see, and this is from the small charts I presented, the biggest gain is in the growing companies because the nearest neighbour match model forecasts growth. I think the nearest neighbour match provides a context for earnings information. You know, how are our earnings, how's the subject firm's earnings compared with other firms' earnings, and how's the trend in the subject firm's earnings, T-1 to T, comparable to other firms' earnings. I think there's exciting lots of area for future research. So just as an example, if you go back to our simple RBM example, you can see that we've got 10 matches. In the full model, we've got 80 matches. This gives a variation in the future earnings forecast. So we've got the furthest away match on both sides. We've got a variance as well as a median and a mean. So I think an important next step is to look at what do we learn from the population, the distribution of matches that can help us learn more about things like we may be able to forecast next earnings expectation. It'd be certainly nice to know how confident we are in that estimate. We haven't started to do that, but we certainly have thought about doing that. So at that point, let me open it up for any other questions.
Peter here, like, did you calculate any, like, prediction interval to see how is the accuracy of the interval, like in sense of interval for when you compare between like in M and like the regression model and the random walk? Did you do something like that, like 95 confidence interval for the prediction?
No, we haven't, but I think that's something that is absolutely worth pursuing. I hear what you're saying. I mean, we've got 80 observations, right? So we've got a distribution. And so we can talk about the confidence that we have in the point estimate of the forecast, because we've got an entire distribution of forecast, of which that's just a part. So the answer to your question is no, we haven't done anything, but clearly that's something that, I think you've asked the key question. This is something we're really, I think it's an interesting extension of this work. I think, I know that we all say this, but I think there's enough in the paper as it is, and to start doing that would kind of muddy the waters, to be honest with you. But I think it's a great suggestion.
Okay.
And it's also relatively easy to do. My co-author Steve Monahan has a paper where he uses quantile regressions to get the kind of distribution that you're talking about. And this is a similar idea, or your idea is a very similar idea. In other words, you would like to know, I would like to know, earnings next period is forecast to be $5.10, but we'd love to know whether it's going to be within a tight range, $5.05 to $5.15, or is it going to be all the way from $3 to $7? So I think that's a key question, as a matter of fact.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear Professor Peter, for this very, really interesting.
Good evening, Professor. Can I ask something?
Yes, you can.
Sure, please.
Okay, you tested the model with the American sample, right? With the US sample.
Yes.
If we apply this model to, for example, emerging market, let's say Turkey, what shall we do as an additional analysis? For example, according to my understanding, your assumption is the capital markets are effective, there are many investors, and the accounting information is an important information.
Yes.
Okay. But when we talk about an emerging country, and if we want to forecast the future earnings of the companies, from my home country, for example, crisis is a part of the country. So what should we do when we make such analysis? Do you recommend something as a robustness test, or I don't know, whatever you say for the safety margins of the calculations? I don't know.
Yeah, no, I hear the question. I think I can't be very specific about the answer to that question, because the model takes whatever are the reported variables, be it earnings before special items, bottom line earnings, street earnings, or sales, or any other item, as reported. It might be possible, and I'd have to think a lot more about this. It may be interesting to compare, say, Turkey, and the ability of this model to forecast with the United States or the UK or any other market where, to use your words, the information is perhaps more reliable, and see whether the past is less or more useful in forecasting the future. That's one answer. The second answer is, one of the things that we have done is we've done the analysis with and without special items. And the results are in fact very, very similar, which suggests that so long as the sequence itself is meaningful, then the nearest neighbour match model works better than the alternative model. That's all that we can say. Does that answer the question?
Okay, and I have another question, and I will not take your time anymore. Do we need a minimum number of observations for this model? Because in my sample, it won't be, for example, like even 10,000 is impossible for me if we are talking about annual data.
Yeah, there's a couple of answers to that question. First of all, we show that the optimal number of matches is 80. But at the same, we show that matching on just 10 improves substantially on a random walk. So that's figure one. The second question is, we also do the analysis within Pharma French 12 industries. And some of those industries are fairly small. And you see that the model works, right? In other words, I'm just looking for this.
Thank you so much, Professor.
Yeah.
بروفيسور بروفيسور حسين
I'm just
عبده
finding a slide here, just bear with me.
بروفيسور حسين عبده from Lancaster University. Okay.
Yeah, so if you look at this slide, you know, as a matter of fact, off the top of my head, I don't know how many observations are in these industries, but I suspect that in your sample, you'll have as many observations in your country as in some of these industries. And, you know, so sample size will not be a tremendous problem. It's my first reaction. I hope it.
Dr. Hussein Abdo? Dr. Hussein? You can hear me? You can open your mic and ask your question. Dr. Hussein Abdo, you have any question? Are there any questions? Yeah, Dr.
Hi, Peter.
Yeah. You can ask Dr.
Hello, I can hear you.
It's Hussein from Manchester in the UK.
Oh, how are you?
I'm fine, thanks. Yourself?
Good, thanks.
Good. First of all, thanks very much for sharing such an interesting presentation, and I can see how there is a growing demand on using alternative methodologies rather than conventional regression family in different areas, one of them earning management or earnings in general. It's rather a comment, it's not a question. Going back to the assumption question or the sampling, one of the advantages of using non-parametric modeling techniques such as k-nearest neighbor or neural networks or genetic algorithms, it does not require similar assumptions to those are required under the regression family.
Right.
And in my point of view, that's an advantage, because why should winds-wise data, for example, or normalized data, in reality, in real field, the data are different. So I'm with the school that against or anti normalizing, winds-rising, changing the nature of the data. We shall use the data as it is in the real field.
Yes.
One more suggestion would be, I would agree, first of all, with you that the paper is currently stand, a lot of analysis there, a lot of ideas there, and let's wait and see. I'm not sure whether you say or not, but let's wait and see what the reviewers will come back with.
Yes.
But one more suggestion for future research. is to extend the analysis beyond the nearest neighbor match, because I'm aware that gene algorithm, which genetic algorithm, gene expression, for example, is one of the newly non-parametric techniques we will consider not only the matching algorithms, but it will consider the behavior of the analysts and behavior of previous historical data sets beyond 2 years. So it might be useful. I can't tell definitely until you try it, but it might be worth the effort to try different techniques as well as kind of future research, or compare results with the NNM. One other suggestion as well, one of the neural networks might help as well, as in neural networks, it does fit the nature of complex relationship between complex data, and you can use it, as you said, for smaller samples, for larger samples, for thousands of observations, or maybe only a couple of dozens of observations as well.
Right.
That's it, and I hope one day we can meet and work together in the future. But thank you very much for your interesting presentation.
Yeah, no, Hussein, I absolutely take your point. And I don't mean to be defensive here, but my sense is there's a number of these, how do we classify them? We'll say more sophisticated, less reliant on standard econometric procedures, methods.
Absolutely.
That we could and perhaps should consider. I think my response, if you were the referee, Hussein, would be one step at a time.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
Yeah.
What I meant, Peter, is for the future, it might be worth having more than one non-parametric, non-regression model, and see whether one of them will give more accuracy. And I'm aware the accuracy level could be measured by a lot of things, Kolmogorov and Renault, Frog curves, or even the error rates.
Right.
But my view is it might worth investigating that one of the other techniques might give lower or higher error rates, and this will add to the literature.
Right.
So nothing wrong with your paper. I like it so much. I like the presentation and a lot of information there. But as kind of the next step for the future, might worth.
I totally agree. I also suspect people are already doing this. If anybody on the call is aware of other people that are doing similar,
I'm not aware of any between me and you.
Yeah.
That's an advantage at the same time, isn't it?
We want to give true attribution or fair attribution, but we also want to know what other people are doing. Because in some sense you could look at this and say, well, these guys have done it, but it had to be done. It's kind of something that really given, and you label them as more sophisticated or machine learning techniques. It had to happen, But
I'm a big fan of machine learning, and I believe it would make a massive difference. Considering the COVID-19 and the whole remote world now, I think it would have an influence on not only financial markets but different areas.
I agree. Totally.
Thanks once again, Peter, and best of luck. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Hussein.
Thank you very much, dear Professor Peter Easton, for your contribution and your effort. I think that you have done very well with answering and a lot of questions there, Professor Peter. So that thank you very much. Ended so all that remains for me to say is thank you everyone that joined us, and I thank you very much for taking the time out to present to us today, dear Professor Peter Aston. It's been really appreciated. Thank you very much.
It was a great pleasure. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Mohammed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you. Peter, can you share your email address on the chat box, please?
Probably. I'm not familiar with this system. Let me just give it to you. It's very easy.
I'll do it for you.
It's Peter. Okay. Thank you, Samir.
Okay, I will take from Mohammed. Okay, thank you so much.
Okay. You're welcome.
Okay, have a good day.
Thank you very much, dear Professor Peter. I hope to see you soon in Egypt.